And our keynote speaker is Nancy Fugate Woods. She is a professor at the University of Washington. She told me just minutes ago that she actually does have a Southern connection through her teaching at Duke and through her PhD at UNC. So you're an honorary SNRS member for the whole conference here, and maybe we can get you to join following. How's that? Dr. Woods is one of the premier researchers in women's health, and since the 1970s, she's really had a wonderfully active program of research that has built a body of knowledge that's really informed not only nursing practice, but women's health care. And we are absolutely thrilled that she was willing to come and talk to us as our keynote speaker today. So Dr. Woods, welcome.
Good morning. It is a real pleasure to be here with you back in the South. As you heard, Cindy was telling you that I actually began my formal part of my research career here in the South. I was a faculty member at Duke University from 1972 to 78, and then also studied for my PhD, which I'm old enough that there really were not many PhD programs in nursing, so I earned a degree from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in epidemiology, and then continued to work in nursing for the rest of my career, and that's what I'm still doing. The theme for this meeting should probably be collaboration. You've just seen it in action, and thank you very much for your help. I am going to talk this morning about studying symptoms and attempt to share with you some pearls from participants for refreshing our research. And actually, if there were a theme for my talk this morning, it would be using those pearls from participants. I want to introduce you to Ellen Sullivan Mitchell, who's not here, but who for the better part of my career at the University of Washington has been a co-investigator. We've alternated who was the PI, who was the co-PI on our projects over the years. And she is still speaking to me. And we are continuing to collaborate together, even though Ellen has officially been retired now for about 10 years. She's very committed to continuing our work and does it, as she tells me, to keep her brain functioning. Ellen joined our team when she was a PhD student. And she happened to be a PhD student who was a nurse practitioner practicing with women, focusing on women's health and primary care. And because of her wisdom, we together were able to engage women over the course of several studies and actually to engage the participants in helping us envision what needed to be the next stage of our research. This is a long list of some of the collaborators, many of the collaborators who've worked with us on a variety of the studies that I'll talk about. And this is a great big thank you to many of the sources of support for the research that we've been able to do over the years. So my purpose today is to talk a bit about the research on symptoms and symptom clusters that we've done during the menopausal transition and early postmenopause as a foundation for symptom management research. And to propose some approaches to developing self-management and shared management for symptoms and symptom clusters. And then as I go through this conversation, I'd really like to talk about what we have learned from participants. And you'll see throughout a scattering of the questions that the women raised that we've really tried to answer. So I'd like to dedicate my presentation to really thousands of women. And because I have been a Women's Health Initiative investigator, that would be probably now close to about 200,000 women who've been involved in various and sundry studies that I've had a chance to be an investigator for over the years. And then also to the hundreds of women's health researchers who've led and collaborated in conducting these studies for their investment in advancing women's health. Now, this is a diagram that I used once in a class because I was trying to show students how one develops a program of research. So you probably cannot see this terribly clearly, and it really doesn't matter. If you were to look at this diagram, you would probably say, this woman has no focus. But the focus is really, if you follow the arrows, what is common to all these studies is a focus on developing the science of symptoms. And where we have ended, or where I am now, is somewhere down in this far right-hand corner. We probably need a continuation, because we have gone from early studies looking at the prevalence of symptoms when we were, Ellen and I both had brown hair. We were studying the menstrual cycle together. And you can see what happens as we got a little bit older. We started thinking that menopause was really interesting. And, and now, the last thing I published was a paper on aging well, using data from the Women's Health Initiative study. So you can see that we also have a bit of personal passion that is attached to what we study. And I will talk a little bit about some of these studies in more detail. I think these are on your website, too, so you can sort of pick and choose if there's anything that's helpful. So I'd like to start out with this very familiar site and talk a little bit about some of the theoretical foundations for studying symptoms that we have used over the years. And what I think is really important is realizing that what we're studying by definition is bodily sensations or feelings that constitute a unique source of information about health. If you're sitting there having a symptom, nobody else in this room really knows what that feels like except you. So one of the epistemological assumptions, if you're going to study this area, must be that these are perceptions of an atypical physical, emotional, or cognitive state that can only be directly available to the person who's perceiving that symptom. And we need to rely on self-report. Yes, we can find ways of doing things like monitoring skin temperature if we're studying hot flashes, but guess what? That doesn't correspond very well to what women really feel. So I think it's important in laying the foundation that we pay attention to the fact that there are many different dimensions of symptoms that women and men experience. Actually, men also experience hot flashes in conjunction with sometimes the therapies that they receive for prostate cancer. So important for men too. We can talk about symptoms with respect to the type of symptom. We can talk about whether somebody's feeling pain, feeling blue, or hot. We can talk about the presence or absence. We can ask people in general, are you having this or not having this? We can ask the frequency. How often do you experience this? How many times a day? We ask women about the severity of their symptoms. Is this barely noticeable, or is it really extreme and severe? We can ask about the duration. We can ask whether the symptoms are bothersome. Are they bothering you? We can ask about the burden. How much is this impacting you? And then we can ask about interference. Is it disrupting your activities of daily living, such as your work, relationships, and leisure? I am really grateful to the oncology nurses who have really important work in leading our thinking about symptoms in a way that probably no other group within nursing has done. And they have given us two things to think about. One is the burden, and here sometimes that's estimated as the number of symptoms times the severity. And I think what's really important is the gift of Janet Carpenter and her colleagues in studying interference, the degree to which a symptom, such as hot flashes, interferes with your daily living, including your work, your social, leisure, sleep, mood, concentration, relationships, sexuality, and enjoyment of life. Some of the properties of symptoms that make them complicated to study are that they're sometimes related to underlying pathology, but not always. And they often reflect functional problems versus a clearly defined lesion or something that will show up in a list of medical diagnoses. Symptoms can serve as a phenotype if we are careful about how we describe and study them. So an example might be thinking about the symptoms that occur with an MI in women. They are sometimes different than those symptoms that are traditionally experienced by men. And so some of the researchers probably in this room who have studied that topic will know this. So the phenotypic expression may be different in different groups of people. So, for example, men and women may experience things differently. Symptoms are often an expression of distress. They are shaped by culture. So many years ago in the 1970s, when people were studying hot flashes among Japanese women, they discovered that there really wasn't a word for hot flashes in the language, and that only women who'd gotten exposed to Western education in Japan at that time were actually complaining that they had the symptom that we would call a hot flash. How we express symptoms can be a social act. So influenced by how we're socialized, that yes, this is a symptom that we typically experience as we age or with menopause, etc., but that we learn about symptoms and we learn about attributions that we make about symptoms. Now, some of the other properties of symptoms that make for consideration as we study them is that these are dynamic. They don't stay the same. Symptoms change over time, and the trajectory of change can be acute or it can be gradual. We can see a gradual worsening of something or a rapid improvement of a symptom. Symptoms can occur in episodes, so we can have discrete periods of time where we have symptoms and then go on to not experience them. So that was one of the things that we studied when we were studying premenstrual symptoms. They occurred in the week before menses, and then after the menstrual flow was finished, they dissipated. Symptoms can recur. So they can come back. They can come back on a regular basis, as with menstrual cycle symptoms, when a woman is in the premenses or when the woman is bleeding. But they can also not recur. So we need dynamic methods for research, for example, using symptom diaries. This is a very basic model that we have used for studying symptoms and illness behavior. We started out reading literature, actually, in medical sociology, where David Mechanic at that time had been studying symptoms. And some of you may know his studies of injecting medical students, this is pre-IRB, with epinephrine. And lo and behold, they had many, many symptoms of stress. Not that they didn't to start with, but their experience was quite dramatic. Mechanic, in his theoretical model, talked about symptoms being perceived and then evaluated for seriousness, whether they were treatable, etc., and then responded to. So before people took action, his thinking was that people not only perceived symptoms, but they made some judgments or some evaluation of the symptoms they were experiencing. And that the evaluation and the responses were influenced by culture and by the explanatory models that we have in our heads about what is this that we're experiencing. So I'm going to start talking a little bit now about one example, and that's the Seattle Midlife Women's Health Study. And I'd like to tell you a bit about that. For those of you who don't know, that's the Space Needle and Mount Rainier in the background. This was a logo that we developed for this study because we had, during one phase, we had women keeping urine samples in their freezers at home, and actually it works for certain assays. And we had refrigerator magnets that had this logo on it, because it was the reminder of when their next sample was due. And that's the source. So here is our original research team for that study. Ellen Mitchell, you've met before, and Martha Lentz on the far right of that slide, and that's what I looked like before I had all this gray hair in 1990, that was. We were first funded for this series of studies to look at midlife women's health and health-seeking behavior. At the time, we really didn't have the intention of studying menopause, but you'll see how that just happened. So beginning in 1990, we were very fortunate to be funded with one of the original Centers for Nursing Research grants, and we were actually funded to create a Center for Women's Health Research. The study there were two R01s that were embedded in that. One was a study of midlife women, health and health-seeking behavior, and another was a study on stress and sleep in midlife women that studied some of the women who were in the midlife study, and that was led by Joan Shaver. Our initial purpose was to describe the health status, symptoms, and health-seeking behavior of midlife women. And you can see where we went from there. We began in 1990 by screening over 11,000 households in the Seattle area. Now remember, this is before cell phones. So we could get a directory of telephones and addresses. We started out doing full ascertainment of several neighborhoods that were in multi-ethnic areas of the city because we wanted to have multi-ethnic representation in the study. And we started out by interviewing 500 women, and then by 1992, we asked women if they would engage in the longitudinal phase of the study by keeping a daily symptom diary. Well, this diary was, because we were just, finishing studying the menstrual cycle, this diary was about 2 months long. So only about 70% of women were willing to do that long diary, but they did it, and we learned a great deal from that, including that we really didn't need to have a diary that required so much burden. So we began in 1996, as we really got into studying menopause, engaging women in keeping frequent but shorter symptom diaries, and also providing monthly urine specimens that we could then assay for a number of hormones that I'll tell you about in a minute. In 2000, we had about 200 women who were still actively engaged with a study, meaning they hadn't experienced their own final menstrual period, and they hadn't dropped out. And from them, we obtained buccal smears for genotyping. This was a quite well-educated sample of women with an average of about 16 years of education. The majority were employed. 75% at the beginning were white. We had about 10% Asian American women and about 12% African American women at the time that we began the study. And the majority of women were living in a partnered relationship. So from those original study aims of looking at midlife women, we knew also that over the years, as we were understanding what was going on with menopause, we added aims about developing a staging system and looking at the endocrine factors influencing symptoms, and then finally looking at gene polymorphisms. But those were not part of the original vision for this study. One of the smartest things that we did with that original study was we invited women to talk with us. And at the end of the very first interview, and probably one of the reasons why the interviews took 2 to 3 hours, was that we asked women, is there anything I should have asked you about that I didn't? Is there anything else you'd like to tell me? And the interviewer said, you said that these interviews were only going to be an hour long, but we're not getting out of these houses for, 2 or 3 hours. And, is that okay? And we went back to the IRB and they said, yeah, that's fine, it's fine. But what happened is those women in this study were generating a research agenda. They were telling us what mattered to them. And so given where we were in the process of doing this study, we were able to learn from what our participants were telling us. They wanted to know things like, what is happening to my body? Why are my periods getting irregular? Is this menopause? How long will this last? That was one of the most common questions. How will I know when my periods will stop? And what is happening with my hormones? And so one of the first things that Ellen said we needed to do, based on what the women were telling us, was develop a staging system for reproductive aging. We had all of this data, so imagine the number of files, imagine, especially in the middle of the study, having data obtained monthly, so somewhere between a few times a year to every month each year from several hundred women with about 60 symptoms in the diary, and that was just one piece of the study. We needed an organizing framework to think about how to look at these data. And the women were asking us, how do I know when this is going to be over with? How do I know what's going on with my body? So we decided that it would be really smart if we could develop a staging system so that the researchers and clinicians would be able to compare across women, but also compare data across studies, because there was no clear way of doing that. Up until the point of Ellen's paper, we were either premenopausal, meaning somewhere between our menarche and our final menstrual period, or postmenopausal, sort of between our final menstrual period and death, which was not a precise staging system. It wasn't going to help us much. So we thought that women wanted to understand the timing and the duration of this transition to menopause. They wanted to know what are the consequences for my fertility and whether their bleeding patterns were normative. And the clinicians in women, we thought, could then time decisions about assessment and prevention. So when should you begin osteoporosis screening? So we reviewed thousands of menstrual calendars. I'll show you one in a moment. And we began to notice patterns of cycles over time. And that was Ellen's clinical vision in looking at these menstrual calendars. We applied decision rules that Ellen developed and then that we also discussed in consultation with Mike Souls, a physician who was directing infertility services at UW-Medicine. So when we met to talk about staging, we were talking about menstrual calendars. Mike was talking about doing invasive procedures for diagnoses where he was actually doing follicle counts, how many antral follicles in a woman's ovary, which was quite appropriate given his focus. And then one day he said, we should get National Institutes of Health to pay attention to this. Let's talk to people at NIH and see if we can't get them to help us with some funding to pull together a meeting. So Sherry Sherman, who unfortunately recently died this past year from advanced breast cancer, was at the time a project officer who was very receptive to this. So together, we put together a conference that brought people from all over the world to look at staging reproductive aging. So this is a bit of what we got from that conference. This is a menstrual cycle calendar that Ellen and I had used for many years, and if you look at the top of it, whoops, this one always skips ahead. You'll see the days of the month going down, and you'll see the rows are months of the year. So this is for one whole year, one woman's menstrual record for an entire year, 1998 it says. And you'll see that this woman, if you put a straight edge against the first B in each of the lines, you'd see that it's pretty straight, pretty regular. That's sort of a way of eyeballing these data. But then, as a woman begins to experience the transition to menopause, what you notice is that those lines aren't quite so even anymore. And in fact, what we noticed was that there would be 7 days or more difference in the length of one menstrual cycle to the next. And we call that the early menopausal transition stage. And as we looked at the late menopausal transition stage, whoops, that's late reproductive. I'm going the wrong direction. You'll notice there are some months on this calendar that say no bleeding. And by definition, we said that being in the late menopausal transition stage would be denoted by having 60 days or more of no menses. So this was sort of our first step at seeing if we could validate this. And this was Ellen's brilliant insight. Well, we happened to be collecting data on FSH, and because we were using urine samples, we had assayed the urine samples not only for FSH, but for estrone, E1G, in the urine. And you'll notice what we learned from that is you see the blue estrone levels actually increasing as women get into the late menopausal transition stage and not dropping until after their final menstrual period. But you'll see FSH in the green going up as women go through the late reproductive to the early menopause transition to the late menopause transition and then to postmenopause. When we showed these data to women, they were really thrilled. You know, we were kind of thinking they were pretty simplistic, but what the women loved was that we also sent them a profile of their hormones. And that, for them, was one of the most exciting things about the study because it was about them. So they also wanted to know not just what their hormones were doing, but they wanted to have questions answered like, why am I having hot flashes and sweats? Why am I waking up in the middle of the night? Why do I feel blue? What is causing these symptoms? And more appropriately, how long is this going to last for some women? So we asked the question, are these symptoms related to menopause? And we could actually, through doing a literature review, come up with about 200 different symptoms that various and sundry studies had said were related to menopause. But these were sort of the main ones that we looked at. Here is a picture of the health diary. We learned after the first 5 years of this study, when it took the better part of 1 person week of hours to code and enter data from the diary, that having the scannable form was a really smart way to get these data. So this is the scannable form breakthrough and the 3-day health diary. And you can see on this page is just a list of symptoms, and women would circle or darken the circle that corresponded to severity. So I'm going to take you through a series of studies. These are all, or a series of slides. These are all sort of the same layout. So on the left, you'll see the late reproductive stage. That's before women have started the menopausal transition. Next, you'll see the early stage of the transition where women are off, where their cycles are irregular by 1 week or more. The late stage where they're skipping, where their cycles are off by 60 days or more, and early postmenopause, which is the first 5 years. So if you looked at this, you would see that hot flashes become more severe during the late transition stage and early postmenopause. So I'm going to have you look for a pattern here. Nighttime awakening becomes more severe during the late transition and early postmenopause. CESD depression scores increase during the late menopausal transition and early postmenopause. Difficulty concentrating becomes more severe during the late menopausal transition stage. Back pain becomes more severe during the late menopausal transition stage. Sexual desire decreases from the late menopausal transition stage to early postmenopause. Vaginal dryness increases during the early postmenopause. So what you began to see in that series of slides, and what we were seeing, is that as women progressed through the transition, once they got to that late transition stage, their symptoms tended to peak. Now, women also wanted to know, how long is this going to last after I'm finished with the menopausal transition. And because there were limited data beyond the first year postmenopause in most studies, we really couldn't answer that question. So the persistence of symptoms, we looked to a study that had been done in Australia, and we found, lo and behold, that 40 to 50% of women were still having symptoms up to 5 years after their final period. We recently discovered that wasn't even touching how long some of them lasted. What we also found, though, was that the severity of hot flashes, nighttime awakening, and vaginal dryness actually increased for a while after the final menstrual period. And so let me just show you here in the purple. The purple bars show postmenopause, the beige ones show the late transition stage, and along the bottom are age groups from 40 to 45 to 50 to 55, and then greater than or equal to 60. What you see is that for hot flash severity, women who were in the postmenopause tended to have the most severe hot flashes, and very similar to women who were in their 55 to 60 years and in the late menopausal transition stage. We also looked at the years before and after the final menstrual period. So on your far left is 6 years before, and on your far right, 6 years after. And you'll see that the severity of hot flashes has not dropped very much by that point. So we still have women who are flashing. And what we actually noticed is that if you look at the peak here, the peak severity of hot flashes actually occurs about 1 year after a woman stops her periods, and then it seems to abate. But stay tuned, because when we were looking at women in the Women's Health Initiative study, many were still having hot flashes 10 to 15 years after their final menstrual period, and that was not unusual. We did see that also awakening during the night persisted, and I'm going to come back to this towards the end of my talk, and you'll see that even though that peaked at 1 year after the final menstrual period, it still persisted. So we put a little bit more detail into that mechanic model, and here's what we came up with based on our studies over the years. We saw that symptoms were not only influenced by the menopausal transition factors, such as the menopausal transition stages and estrogen and FSH levels and even testosterone, but general health status, women's health behaviors, personal factors such as body awareness and optimism, social factors such as attitudes towards aging, income adequacy, and the like, and stress arousal were related to symptoms. And I'm going to highlight just a few of those. We used, for those of you who are interested in methodology, and especially the messiness of these data, our data are probably could get an award for being one of the messiest study designs that I've used in a long time, because it's an unbalanced design. The data were obtained to coincide with women's cycles, not with a month or not with a time during the year. So we needed to be able to fit a model to individual patterns of symptoms, predicting severity, that would account for time, so progression in time. We used age as a marker of time, and that would include covariates that were measured at the same time as the symptoms. And we wanted to account for factors that grouped observations, so obviously the reproductive aging stages. In order to do this, Ellen interviewed a number of statistical candidates to create an R program for us to look at these data. This was before such a thing was available off the shelf. And we actually hired somebody who worked at the applied physics lab who was debating whether he would do it or not. And he went home and talked to his wife, and his wife said, "You better do this study." So I thought, okay, we'll use influence wherever we can get it. So he was really instrumental, and we're grateful for his collaboration. And we're especially grateful to his wife for believing in the importance of the study. What I would like to show you quickly is that, yes, most of these symptoms, if you see the ones in bold, most of these symptoms will become worse with age, except depressed mood, and sexual desire actually decreased somewhat with age. The other thing I want to point out here is you'll see that hot flashes were related to each of the menopausal transition stages. They were related to estrogen levels, so higher estrogen, less severe hot flashes, higher FSH levels, more severe hot flashes, but testosterone did not have a major impact on any but the sexual desire symptoms. Depressed mood seemed to peak in the late menopausal transition. Awakening at night, similarly. Difficulty concentrating was a bit less in the early menopausal transition stage, but actually becomes more profound in the late stage, even though that's not significant. Back pain peaked in the late transition stage, and as you can see, many of the factors, the menopausal transition stages affected sexual desire, but having a higher level of estrone was associated with having higher sexual desire, having higher levels of FSH, just the opposite, and having higher testosterone levels also associated with higher levels of sexual desire. So that was really the only symptom that seemed to be related to androgen levels. We also wanted to look at stress in relationship to symptoms. And you can see here across the board stress, women's perceived stress, as they rated it in the daily diaries, was related to every one of these symptoms. And the other thing that we looked at was a history of sexual abuse. And you can see here also, with the exception of back pain, a very important influence. So this was sort of predating the work that was done on acute adverse childhood experiences. Some of these women were still having more acute, more severe symptoms. Health status also, as you might think, perceived health status was related to the symptoms. And BMI, not so much, though associated with back pain. The heavier the BMI, the higher the BMI, the more severe the back pain. The higher the BMI, more likely depressed mood symptoms. So what did we learn with all of that? Well, we learned that, for one thing, some women are more bothered than others by their symptoms, and that the evaluation of the symptoms includes not just how severe they were, but we were reading Janet Carpenter's work that said, hey, these could interfere with work and relationships. So we really wanted to look at, could we understand how these symptoms were influencing work and relationships. So I was going to bet that sleep would be the symptom that would have the greatest influence on work and relationships. And I was wrong. As we began to look at all the factors that influence sleep and relationships, work and relationships, interference was related to perceived stress, so interference in work or relationships. Hot flashes were associated with interference with work, but not so much with relationships. Depressed mood with both, anxiety with both. Awakening during the night with both, but not as big as an impact as I would have imagined. Forgetfulness. But problems concentrating was by far the symptom that had the greatest impact. They were all significant, as you can see here. But if you look at the size of the beta, problem concentrating interfered with sleep, interfered with relationships. And when you talk to women about that, they said, well, of course. So there we were. And here we see not an atypical scene, and at the time, because of our age group, many of us were experiencing some of these same symptoms, and this was not an uncommon sight to see sometimes in people's offices, although this office is much too neat for my taste. Although the menopausal stages, the transition stages, did not interfere with work, the message is that women's symptoms did. So, some insights for symptom management. Women were telling us that they experienced multiple symptoms, but most of the research that we were reading was about hot flashes or depressed mood or sleep, usually about a single symptom, but not about groups of symptoms. And so we thought, we really should be studying symptoms as clusters or groups as a basis for symptom management. And then we started reading the oncology nursing literature and went, hey, look at that. These people are doing this. So here, just so you can see, a simple correlation matrix. Every one of these is associated with every other one, controlling for age, controlling for menopausal transition stage, et cetera, et cetera. So the message is clear. So we began seeing that symptom clusters might offer us a new paradigm for patient-centered care. Could we think about looking at these clusters in ways that would help us identify better ways of managing symptoms for women? So thanks to Lori Cray, who was a PhD student at the time and really wanted to study symptom clusters, we said, have we got a deal for you? We have got about 20 years of data on several hundred women, and oh, by the way, there are about 3,000 data points for each of these symptoms. So we were able, with Lori's help, to use latent class analysis to identify patterns of symptoms. And we were able to see that, I'm going to skip ahead here and just show you what we found. In looking at the patterns of symptoms clustering, what we found was that there were three big clusters, or three primary clusters of symptoms in this Seattle Midlife Women's Health Study sample. Remember, these are community-based women, so these are not patients. These are not women participating in clinical trials. So 70% approximately had all low-severity symptoms. But there was a group of women, about 16%, who had low-severity hot flashes, but you can see they had sort of moderate-level sleep, pain, mood, cognitive, and tension symptoms. And the third group was a group of women who had very high severity hot flashes and low to moderate severity symptoms of other types, so 12%. We then went on to say, what would differentiate these clusters, women with these clusters of symptoms? And we compared the high hot flash group versus the low severity symptoms, and you can see menopausal transition stage made a difference in whether they were more likely to be in the high hot flash group versus low severity. Estrogen and FSH levels, perceived stress, but we also saw higher norepi levels and lower epinephrine levels in the group with high hot flash symptoms, which is amazing because this is very messy data, and it lines up perfectly with some of the laboratory studies of hot flashes. So our very messy data set lined up pretty well with these highly controlled studies done in laboratory settings. We also saw that there were some gene polymorphisms, particularly 17-beta-HSD, that differentiated women with the high severity hot flashes and the low severity symptom group. When we compared the women who had the moderate severity symptoms versus the low severity symptoms, we again saw perceived stress was important. The women with the moderate symptoms were more stressed, but they also had lower epinephrine levels, not unlike the women with a high hot flash severity. So we really got into thinking that we needed to pay attention to symptom clusters, not just single symptoms, and that we needed to look at how these were in fact affecting well-being. So fortunately, over the last 7 years, I've been involved as a co-investigator on the Ms. Flash trials, which is a series of intervention trials for hot flashes and other menopause-related symptoms. And what I want to show you now is what you see with symptom clusters when you study women who are in clinical trials. So these women all had to have hot flashes, severe enough to get into this study, and they all had to have several hot flashes a day. So in the first cluster, you see this is very hard for you to see, I'm sure, but you see that women have very severe hot flashes, but they also tend to have very severe sleep symptoms. That's what lines 2 and 3 are. It's the ISI and the PSQI. And they have, in the fuchsia color, very high severity pain symptoms. In the second group, you see women with a bit less severe hot flashes, but they've got sleep symptoms and they have depressed mood and anxiety symptoms and moderate levels of pain symptoms. So they have almost a full house. The women in the third cluster, that's an insomnia cluster. Those women aren't bothered by much other than sleep. And the fourth cluster is really about mood. Those women have depressed mood, they have anxiety. And there's a fifth cluster, which is just flat, because these are normalized scores. And those are the women who had very low severity symptoms, even the women who had enough hot flashes to meet the criteria for being in this clinical trial. So we're continuing to see, can we figure out more of what is important to understand about these symptom clusters? So how can we incorporate this in symptom management? Is there a role for this? I mean, it's pretty apparent when you look at the oncology nursing literature that there are some symptom management implications that come from knowing the profile of symptoms that people have. So what does support for women's symptom management efforts look like? Well, we think that managing a cluster of symptoms requires consideration of the role of the individual kinds of symptoms as well as the totality. And we also thought that it would be very important to conduct a systematic review of published literature that could suggest therapies that would be most efficacious for symptoms. And together with graduate students, we were able to conduct that review. We looked at the non-hormonal therapies, including mind-body therapies, traditional East Asian medicine. We looked at the use of non-hormonal, non-pharmacological therapeutics. Looking at things like soy and isoflavones, and we also were able to study herbal therapies. And this is just an illustrative matrix, because what we thought is once we could fill in the blanks on a matrix like that, a clinician could say, you know what, this woman has hot flashes, mood, and sleep symptoms. And I think that, you know, it looks like these first 4 options might actually work for her. But if she has pain symptoms, there's really no data because these have not been measured in some of the cluster studies. And difficulty concentrating, it looks like maybe the mind-body therapy might be the most useful there. So what we're working on is seeing if we can take this one more step to say, here are some ways of thinking about multi-symptom therapy, not just hot flashes. So as this woman is illustrating, we need additional symptom management options and more than just the ice water on the forehead approach. So this is a saga of why it's not important to get depressed and discouraged when you don't get a good review for your NIH proposal. This proposal actually in different stages of its development was reviewed no less than 4 times. We gave NIH, a couple of different institutes, we said, have we got a wonderful intervention for you? And they said, no, no thank you. So through our work with the Ms. Flash studies, Sue McCurry, who is a bona fide sleep researcher, and I, who had been collaborating on developing this intervention that never got funded by NIH directly, were able to get support for doing a pilot of a telephone-based cognitive behavioral therapy for midlife women who had a menopause-related sleep disturbance. And you're going to see how we were able to integrate a team of investigators from around the country, and how we were able to use women's wise words to help us think about how to structure this study. So this is a quote from a participant whom I interviewed who said, I wake up in the middle of the night and then I have a hot flash. I can't get back to sleep. I lie there worrying about all that I have to do the next day. I feel so stressed out. And I'll have to tell you, I heard that time and time and time and again. So this was the model that we began thinking about testing, that we would start with women experiencing menopause-related sleep disturbances. We knew that cognitive arousal and prolonged wakefulness was progressing to dysregulation of their sleep cycles, and increased nighttime wakefulness and insomnia and decreased sleep quality was affecting their daytime functioning. And that in turn, it reduced their quality of life, increased their vasomotor symptoms, bother, and negative mood. So here was this negative cycle. And we intervened with a telephone-delivered CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy intervention, that was aimed at reducing cognitive arousal and wakefulness, re-regulating the sleep schedule, and reducing nighttime wakefulness and insomnia severity. And lo and behold, we had hypothesized that not only would this improve sleep, but that quality of life and mood, as well as vasomotor symptoms, hot flashes, might also improve as a consequence of this. We evaluated the telephone-based CBTI versus a condition that I helped develop called a menopause education condition. And we studied it for feasibility, treatment fidelity, and acceptability. And specifically, we wanted to know about the efficacy of CBTI versus the menopause education intervention on insomnia symptoms, but also sleep quality. And we also wanted to know the impact on nighttime wakefulness and other sleep outcomes, hot flash bother and interference, and symptoms of depression and anxiety, bodily pain, and quality of life. So here is the study design. This was not so small for a pilot project, but it was very, very good that we were able to study as many women as we could. You can see we randomized women, 100 women, to the cognitive behavioral therapy group or to the menopause education control group. And both groups were contacted by our trained interventionists. They had 30-minute telephone calls with the interventionists, 6 sessions spread out over 8 weeks. They did a daily sleep log, and they had reading materials that they needed to do before every call. And they also read the book, Menopause, Time for Change, from the National Institute on Aging. So what we were about improving sleep hygiene, stimulus control, and sleep restriction to promote sleep. We also were about managing stress and promoting relaxation, and cognitive restructuring, really changing beliefs and attitudes. So for those of you who can't read this, this is one of these midlife women who's looking pretty irritable, who says, don't think of it as hot flashes, think of it as your inner child playing with matches. So she's showing us how we could use cognitive restructuring. These are unpublished results. We will present this in detail at the sleep meetings in the spring. But I want to tell you that our early results so these are not the cleaned up results, are looking as if there is a really significantly greater improvement in sleep with the cognitive behavioral therapy than with the menopause education condition. So far, we have not seen significant differences in hot flashes, but the cognitive behavioral therapy group has improved twice as much as the menopause education group. And the cognitive behavioral therapy group experienced significantly greater improvement in the mood symptoms. So stay tuned, and we will be telling you more soon. One final thing that I just want to make sure we're okay with our time. One final thing I wanted to mention to you was that we also thought that we needed to have a little bit better understanding of the symptom clusters. I was telling you about the study where the woman said, first I wake up, then I have a hot flash. And in order to really study that, I was attempting to do, and we don't often talk about our failures, but let me talk about this one with you. I was asking women if they could draw their symptom clusters, because I also wanted to see if they could draw their explanatory models. And the answer was they could, but it was a terrible, terrible thing, because I was asking women to draw on a piece of paper. And when they got to the part where they needed to group their symptoms, they all had to start all over again, because they didn't have a way of moving things around on the page. And I thought, I could have used Post-its. Why didn't I do that? But, then I got busy and I thought, I'll maybe do something later. Well, in the meantime, I had been doing some collaboration with pediatric oncology nurses who were using iPads to study symptom clusters in adolescents. And I'd been a consultant for their proposals in this project, and I said, do you think we could use that with midlife women? Do you think we could just have this reprogrammed with the symptoms? And do you think we could then ask women to, illustrate what they're experiencing? So we have just finished a small pilot with 30 women. And I'm going to skip quickly to say the women select their symptoms on the screen and they move them up from the bottom row to the top. And eventually, they draw lines connecting the symptoms they think are related. And then a little later on, they put arrows on the lines to illustrate which symptoms they think may cause others. And then we ask them, can you put these symptoms, can you group these? Do they occur in a group? And lo and behold, yes, you see here group 1 and group 2. And can you identify which of these groups is most important? Yes, indeed they could. And here is an example of one of the results. This is why using paper and pencil or paper and pen was totally the wrong approach to doing this study. But this is not atypical. This is one of the women who reported over 20 symptoms, but who could see that some of these were very specifically related to one another. We then go on to interview women to say, can you talk about not only how these symptoms cluster together, but is there a trigger for this group of symptoms? Can you prioritize which of these is really most important to you? And can you tell us what you think causes these? And lo and behold, menopause was not the only attribution. This woman is saying, is it hot in here? Is it me or is it hot in here? Women attributed their symptom clusters to life demands, worry, and other symptoms. So they commented, so again, listening to your participants, several women said, could I get a copy of that picture that you just made? Could you print that out for me? And, our research assistant, who was a PhD student, said, is it okay? And I said, sure, it's there. It's theirs. So we gave them copies. And then I said, could you ask the women what what they would like to do with that? Do they have a particular reason for asking for that? And the women said, I think this would be so helpful. I have such a hard time explaining this when I go for my clinic appointments. If I could just take this picture with me. So what next? Well, I should really be retiring, but we're now asking, can we develop this instrument to facilitate women's conversations with their healthcare providers? Could we develop a report that would be meaningful and useful to the providers as well as to the women? So our next steps are going to be to see if we can enhance the understanding of the meaning and the human experience of the symptom clusters. So can we advance knowledge of the etiology? That would be important, but can we examine the effects of interventions on the clusters? I think we're going to see that when we can change sleep, we can change some of the other symptoms women are experiencing, the cognitive symptoms in particular. And then can we test the effects of using symptom clusters to tailor and target treatment? So I want to thank you for your interest in women's health. I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to leave you with the importance of taking time to listen and to gather the pearls from the participants in your studies. It has taken us a very long way. Thank you.